If you're watching this video, it means that your fantasy playoffs are likely underway. And hopefully your running back situation isn't too much of a worry, but if it is, I'm here to help you out with that. The march to a fantasy championship begins on Thursday Night Football here in Week 15 with Atlanta at Tampa Bay, and Bijan versus Bucky should be a good one. Now, obviously, Bijan Robinson is one of those running backs that we're going to be starting regardless. I just wish that maybe Atlanta was a little bit more consistent on how they're utilizing him. But for Tyler Algier this week, I'm going to list him as a fringe start because I think scoring a rushing touchdown against Tampa Bay absolutely could be in the cards. But if you don't think that he can find the end zone, he's not worth playing because he may only get about 8 rushing attempts. If he doesn't get double-digit rushing attempts and he doesn't find the end zone, he's not going to be worth it. So you got to go with your gut on this one. I will admit, I don't love the Bucky Irving usage last week. Let me rephrase that. I don't love the usage from the other running backs. Bucky Irving had 15 carries, which is solid, but Rachaad White had 11, and Sean Tucker scored a rushing touchdown. Bucky Irving was able to find the end zone in the passing game, which is great, but I don't love that the other 2 running backs were getting that much work. So for Bucky Irving, maybe his upside is just a little bit limited, but we know Atlanta has given up some big running back performances so far this season. For Cleveland and Chicago, I seem to find it odd that Quinshon Judkins has not played better over the last couple of weeks, given the fact that Shedeur Sanders has played very well. I would think that the running game would be getting a little bit of a boost as other opponents were starting to give Shedeur Sanders a little bit more credit. But maybe that's the thing. Maybe they haven't given Sanders enough credit, and now they will in this matchup against Chicago. And if that happens, hopefully Quinshon Judkins can give us a really solid fantasy day. He's a start for me, but I would say he's probably on the lower end of that spectrum and more like a low-end RB1 at best, with more RB2 or mid-range RB2 potential. Dylan Sampson could end up being a flex option if anyone out there has an emergency and needs to find somebody to start. Tyler Algier, Dylan Sampson are going to be a couple of the guys I mentioned in this video that are emergency flex options, because I know people are dealing with injuries. Maybe you have 2 flex leagues where a lot of people have been taken off waivers already and you're just looking for a little bit of help. For Dylan Sampson, in 2 of the last 3 games, he has 59 and 64 receiving yards with Shedeur Sanders. So they are looking his way in the passing game a little bit more often. If you play in a PPR league, then Dylan Sampson could be that emergency option that you need. DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai are in a 50-50 split in this backfield right now. Kyle Monangai got 1 more carry than DeAndre Swift. However, DeAndre Swift was a little bit better efficiency-wise on the ground and had more targets in the passing game. So they're both going to be a fringe start in a matchup like this. Now, the matchup last week against Green Bay was a little bit more on the tough side, and both of them ended up being just fine. Cleveland, who's been tough against the run this year, just got killed by Tony Pollard, of all people, who hasn't been able to do anything all season long. So maybe these guys can still get it done for us this week. Kyle Monangai, hopefully he can find the end zone again. He seems to be the guy that if you're betting on a touchdown, can get one for Chicago. Baltimore is Cincinnati, and if you have Derrick Henry on your fantasy roster, you are praying that the Baltimore Ravens do not do what they did a couple of weeks ago when these 2 teams faced off on Thanksgiving. Because Derrick Henry looked solid in the first quarter. In fact, he had a 22-yard touchdown run and looked like he was on his way to having a solid night. Cincinnati was and still is leading the league in most fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. But then for some reason or another, he barely got any touches the rest of the game. They put it in Lamar Jackson's hands and just threw, which made absolutely no sense because Lamar Jackson wasn't playing all that well. This week, we need 20 carries out of Derrick Henry, minimum. And if Baltimore wants to win this game, that's exactly what they need to do. Chase Brown on the ground last week was not great, but he did end up finding the end zone twice, which continued a streak of 8 straight games of top 24 performances since the beginning of the season. He was a little bit rough the first few games, and then since then has been much better. His ceiling is not nearly as high as it was last year, but his floor is still very solid. And Baltimore is now allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game, and Brown was solid against them back on Thanksgiving as well. Let's hope that Chase Brown can give us a top 24 floor once again. The Chargers got a huge win at home on Monday Night Football against the Philadelphia Eagles, and now they look to go on the road against Kansas City and end all of their playoff hopes. Omarion Hampton came back and was healthy. At least as healthy as we could expect him to be. When you have any type of a fracture in your leg for a running back, it's going to take a little bit of time. And they never confirmed that's exactly what it was, but we feel like we know at this point. So Omarion Hampton, he may not have some of that explosiveness for another few weeks. In fact, it might be not until next season that we see that from him again. But he was the lead back this past week, and I expect him to continue to be the lead back. It's not a great matchup. Kansas City allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game. I'll list him as a fringe start. Kamani Vidal, really his biggest play last week was 1 reception for over 60 yards. And outside of that, he really didn't do a whole lot of anything. So in this matchup, I'm going to list him as a sit. Omarion Hampton would need to find the end zone to be fantasy viable. There's not a lot to love with this Kansas City backfield. We're not seeing a ton of upside from any of these guys, but there's one guy that's been the most consistent, and that's Kareem Hunt, who now has a rushing touchdown in 5 of his last 6 games. If you're going to bet on anybody scoring fantasy points here, you would want to bet on Kareem Hunt, but it's going to be finding the end zone and not really in terms of volume. Last week, James Cook finished as the RB24, which snapped a streak of 3 straight games inside the top 10. He was showing us a ton of upside once again after having a couple of down performances. However, he now has 2 fumbles in each of the last 2 games, losing 1 in each game as well, which is kind of hurting his fantasy upside right now. Going up against Cincinnati, it was a solid day, but it was not a great day. And when you have a solid day, you can't be fumbling the ball twice and losing fantasy points for fantasy owners. And this matchup, going up against New England, who's allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, it's going to be about the same. The last time he faced New England earlier this season, he was the RB37, and he only ran for 49 yards on 15 carries. Number 1, James Cook needs to hold on to the ball. We cannot lose fantasy points because he's putting it on the ground. Number 2, we need at least 15 carries again, and hopefully he can be just a little bit more efficient on the ground. But number 3, we really need a touchdown. But James Cook has been one of the best running backs in all of fantasy this year. Regardless of the matchup, we're in the fantasy playoffs. You're playing your studs. Ramondre Stevenson and TreVeyon Henderson have a solid matchup in front of them this week. Buffalo is allowing the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. But the key to beating Buffalo and Josh Allen is keeping the ball away from Josh Allen, and you do that by running the football. I could see Ramondre Stevenson and TreVeyon Henderson both having double-digit carries this week. I could also see both of them getting briefly involved in the passing game, especially Stevenson, who seems to be a little bit more involved in the passing game than what TreVeyon Henderson is. But we know TreVeyon Henderson has a ton of big playability, and I think both of these guys have touchdown potential as well. There is some risk to playing both of these guys, but for those of you that don't really have a choice, you may need to start one of them. I would say that TreVeyon Henderson has the most upside, while Ramondre Stevenson probably has the best floor. There was nothing special about Chris Rodriguez last week against Minnesota. He ran for 52 yards on 10 carries, which is actually very solid in terms of efficiency. And maybe he could have seen a bigger day if Washington hadn't lost 31-0. They kind of had to abandon the run for the most part. They also decided to give Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt some touches in the second half after basically being left off the field the entire first half. So it was clear they were trying to keep Chris Rodriguez healthy in a blowout game. And going up against the Giants, it shouldn't be nearly as big as a blowout. And the Giants are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Chris Rodriguez to me is one of those high upside risk plays this week. I think he could have a solid day. I think he could find the end zone, and I think he's going to be good for fantasy. But when you take a look at what he's done so far this season, he hasn't really reached a status where we can put him in green as of yet. Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary are both going to be fringe starts against this Washington defense, allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Tyrone Tracy's the big play guy. He has the opportunity to find the biggest plays on the ground. Devin Singletary's the guy that's going to have the best shot at touchdowns. But I think it is conceivable if this game game stays close or if the New York Giants can be out in front, that both of these guys could end up finding the end zone. They don't have the highest ceilings in the world, but again, we are looking for a few guys here and there that we could potentially put into our lineup as emergency options. Las Vegas versus Philadelphia. Ashton Jeanty versus Saquon Barkley. And this game is going to be my underdog must-watch matchup of Week 15 for the running back position. The Raiders are allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. We've seen Philadelphia get torn up by the run at times this season. Ashton Jeanty and Saquon Barkley are both running backs that we've had a lot of question marks about for a majority of the year. Is this the matchup where they're going to give us the fantasy upside that we need? And if anybody's watching this video that is not happy with how the end of their fantasy season went, there is still time to make it a successful year in fantasy, and we can do that by playing together over on Underdog. We are posting weekly pick'ems that is leading to a ton of green over in our Discord. We post videos here on YouTube, we post picks in Discord, and right now you can make up for any frustrations that you've had by joining us over on Underdog by signing up using code Headliners and making a deposit of at least $10. When you do that and then play your first game for $5, you are going to get $75 in bonus entries. This is exactly the way to find a little bit of second life this fantasy season. And hopefully your experience on Underdog is the same as a majority of our viewers this season who have seen a ton of green on their winning tickets. So head on over to Underdog and play along with us the rest of the season. I gotta leave Ashton Jeanty as a fringe start. Even though Philadelphia has given up some big games on the ground this season, Ashton Jeanty has not shown us enough consistency for me to just list him in green in this matchup. Last week was tough once again. He only got 10 carries and he only had 30 yards. He did end up having 4 targets in the passing game, which realistically is what we need to have. But I don't understand why they just aren't game planning for more Ashton Jeanty work in the passing game. He's your best player on the field outside of Brock Bowers. And maybe with Kenny Pickett potentially starting this week, we will see some more targets for him. For Saquon Barkley, 122 yards, 1 touchdown last week, another big performance, one of which it has been few and far between this season. We really wish that we would have seen more of those performances throughout the year, but he has an opportunity to carry it over against Las Vegas. But my biggest hope here is that Jalen Hurts, after turning the ball over 5 times last week, twice in one play, that they decide, hey, we're going to get Saquon Barkley involved way more often at the beginning of the game, so we don't have to put as much pressure on Jalen Hurts for the entire game. Last week, Breece Hall couldn't get anything going on the ground against Miami's defense, but then when Brady Cook came in to take over for an injured Tyrod Taylor, he apparently forgot that he existed because he only gave Breece Hall 1 target the entire game. Breece Hall has to get targets. That's the way that he makes his fantasy floor. If you're just giving him touches on the ground, he's not nearly as likely to reach it. And then in a matchup against Jacksonville, who's allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, it makes Breece Hall even riskier because we don't even know who's going to be playing at quarterback yet this week. Travis Etienne had a solid day last week, scored a couple of touchdowns, had a couple of big runs, and now he gets the New York Jets, allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Not having Quinnen Williams in the middle of that defensive line is making things a whole lot easier. So for those of you that have been lacking some Travis Etienne upside over the last few weeks, this is his time to shine in the playoffs. Arizona has a terrible matchup against Houston this week. I am staying away from all of their running backs. Emari Demercado is going to end up being questionable again. Bam Knight, he's got touchdown potential, but that's about it. Trey Benson, this is a guy that this is the last week for him to be activated off the IR. We've been teased for the last couple of weeks, but if Arizona doesn't do it this week, he cannot return this season. So we're going to find out whether or not holding on to Trey Benson was actually worth it. But Houston is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. In fact, they're allowing a whole lot of nothing to basically everybody. Arizona, however, is allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And with Nick Chubb dealing with a rib injury right now, Woody Marks could end up seeing a ton of the volume this week. The only reason Dare Ogunbowale got that rushing touchdown last week was because Woody Marks got smoked on the play before and had to come off the field. Had he been able to stay on the field, he likely ends up getting that rushing touchdown. He had 26 carries last week with Nick Chubb banged up. And at this time of the year, if you can get 26 carries from a running back and a matchup this good, it could bring a whole lot of potential. Green Bay at Denver, and this is not a great matchup for Josh Jacobs. Right now, Denver is allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but the hope is that Green Bay can move the ball down the field, and if they can, Josh Jacobs will find a rushing touchdown. But Josh Jacobs has been one of those guys this season that we just can't sit. He's played well in tough matchups. He played well against Detroit just a couple of weeks ago, and Detroit allows fewer fantasy points per game on the ground than what the Denver Broncos do. RJ Harvey is going to be towards the bottom of that fringe start list. I'm not going to have him ranked very high this week. He's going up against Green Bay, allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game, and for a majority of the year, he has not been ultra efficient. He wasn't bad last week, and he's got 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games, but we need RJ Harvey to be more efficient on the ground, and I don't think this is the matchup for it. Detroit at the LA Rams, and the LA Rams are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs right now. David Montgomery, I'm going to leave him as a fringe start. We saw a pretty big play from him last week, scored a touchdown. Maybe Dan Campbell is going to continue to try and get him going. But Jahmyr Gibbs, we're not sitting him. Now, this season, we have seen some back and forth performances. He has a huge game and then kind of a letdown game. A huge game and kind of a letdown game. Well, Jahmyr Gibbs owners, he's coming off of a huge game in a really tough matchup. So maybe the floor shouldn't be nearly as high as what we would like to expect with Jahmyr Gibbs, but we know he's got potential to help in the passing game, and we know he's got plenty of potential to score a touchdown. The Lions are allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and right now there are a ton of questions about Blake Corum and Kyren Williams. This was basically an even split last week. Kyren Williams had 1 more carry than what Blake Corum did, but Blake Corum was by far more explosive with a 48-yard touchdown run. This week against Detroit, I do expect them to move the ball through the air with Matthew Stafford, Puka Nacua, and Devontae Adams. It's going to be all about the touchdowns, though. Can Kyren Williams and Blake Corum find the end zone? They absolutely could, especially if they get up near the goal line. But without those touchdowns, it's going to be really tough for both players. So if you've got guys that have more upside at the running back position, it may be worth playing them over Williams and Corum this week. For Carolina at New Orleans, the last time we saw these two guys on the field together, they both were getting some fantasy looks. And right now, we've got another backfield with fringe starts because that's exactly what they are. Chuba Hubbard could help in the passing game. Rico Dowdle could find the end zone on the ground. Right now, it feels like Chuba Hubbard is going to start getting a few more touches because Rico Dowdle hasn't been nearly as good the last couple of games as he was at the beginning of the year. So don't be shocked if Chuba Hubbard walks away with more touches than what Rico Dowdle does this week. But I don't think we can just cast Rico Dowdle to the side either right now. Devin Neal was solid last week, and Carolina is allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. It's much tougher to throw on Carolina than it is to run on Carolina. So Devin Neal, to me this week, could end up giving us a very safe floor. Tennessee at San Francisco, and Tony Pollard did absolute work against Cleveland last week. So does Tennessee ride him against San Francisco this week? I would hope so, but it's 2025. Everything that should make sense doesn't make sense, and the things that don't make sense happen more often than not. For Tony Pollard, when you have a game like that and Tennessee ends up winning a game like that, you really have to try and replicate that in the very next game. And against San Francisco, to me, that seems to be the winning strategy. So I hope that Tony Pollard gets 20 plus carries again. And obviously for San Francisco, you're starting Christian McCaffrey. Had the bye week last week, should be fresh and ready to roll. My only concern would be is that San Francisco beats the brakes off Tennessee very early, and if they do, that Christian McCaffrey unfortunately just doesn't keep up with them in terms of overall volume, because they decide to give him a little bit more of a rest. Number one, this is a really tough matchup for Jonathan Taylor. Seattle is allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But number two, we don't even know who the quarterback is going to be. Riley Leonard was banged up after last week's game. And right now, the Indianapolis Colts are working out 44-year-old grandfather Philip Rivers. Jonathan Taylor has two outcomes this week. Number one, he's just fine, has a big day because they run the crap out of him. Maybe he finds a big run or two and he finds his way into the end zone 1 or 2 times. That, or he has a terrible day because Seattle decides to just sell on the run, stop Jonathan Taylor, and make one of these quarterbacks try to beat them through the air in single coverage. I do not feel great about this, but regardless of the outcome, you gotta start JT. Neither of these running backs did much of anything last week, and it wouldn't shock me if neither of them did much of anything again this week. But is that a one-off performance? Because Kenneth Walker, for several weeks, had seen at least 60 total yards in every single game. Zach Charbonnet was finding the end zone on a pretty regular basis. It was making them both fantasy viable as flex options. Last week was terrible. This week, though, we could be right back to the same thing. There is a lot of risk with playing either of these guys, though. Minnesota at Dallas on Sunday Night Football, and Dallas is still allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs after getting absolutely shellacked by Detroit last week and Jahmyr Gibbs. Hey, even David Montgomery had a big-time touchdown run as well. Aaron Jones is going to be a start for me because of what he can also do in the passing game. He's also the bigger play running back here. Jordan Mason, as long as Minnesota can move the football, has an opportunity to find the end zone this week once again. And for Dallas, we're going to play Javonte Williams. He's continued to be very solid all season long. And I don't think nearly as much people are talking about him as you should be because Javonte Williams is making a case for fantasy MVP. When you take into account the expectations that people had for him, where he was drafted, and now the fantasy outcomes that you've gotten from him, he has to be up there as one of the best picks of this entire year. Miami at Pittsburgh on Monday Night Football, and right now Pittsburgh is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Devon Achane is in a tough situation this week. He's banged up and probably going to be questionable in this matchup. It's also a really tough matchup, but Devon Achane has been a RB2 in every single game this season with RB1 upside as well. So you gotta play him, but are you going to be able to wait on him? Because if he doesn't end up playing, you either have to have Jalen Wright on your team or you're going to end up being left out in the cold unless you have somebody from Pittsburgh you can put in your lineup. Just make sure that you keep an eye on all of the information for Devon Achane the rest of the week so we know exactly what we have to do when it comes to Friday and Saturday. And for Pittsburgh, Jaylen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell are both going to be starts for me this week. Both of them get work in the passing game. Both of them have been solid on the ground. Miami's been decent at times against the run, but they haven't been great against the run either. Jaylen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell, to me, give us flex options again this week. Headliner Nation, that's going to do it for my entire breakdown of the running back position here in week 15. And I know there's a lot of fringe starts, but make sure that you're listening to what I'm saying and not just reading what's on the screen. Right now, we have to do a lot of fringe starts. That's just the way the NFL is currently. Trust me, I would love it if we were getting more definitive outcomes so I could give you more definitive answers. But I think, like we've all seen this season, that unfortunately just isn't possible. So do me a favor, if you like the analysis and you want to help support what we do here, it's quick, it's easy, and it's simple to do. Just hit the like button. But if you're new here to the channel, subscribe, turn on the bell notification so you don't miss the notifications when we drop new content, and make sure you leave a comment down below. But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm gonna go talk about tight ends. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.